Hey there, everyone. This is Chess Coach Aaron, and I'm here for the second of three Greco Gambit games. Greco Gambit is a fun, spicy opening, gives you some good attacking chances, and I really believe beginners should choose one or two spicier attacking openings just to get better as being an attacker. It's a lot of fun. And what do we mean by gambit? As in a Greco Gambit, you want to give something and get something for it. Usually gambits in the opening usually mean you're offering a pawn and you get something for it, some space, better development, happier pieces, possible attacks, etc., etc. In the Greco Gambit, usually when accepted, it usually means white gets more time because it's harder for some of the black pieces to ever come into the games, especially the queenside pieces. Or if black doesn't accept, the white will usually get a very strong center. So it's a lot of fun to play, and this is from one of my Blitz games a long time ago, not quite a year ago, about 10 months ago. And I go through waves of playing certain gambits for fun. So right now I'm in the middle of playing the Danish Gambit, but I think I'm kind of done with that. I've done about 2 months of the Danish Gambit. Maybe I'll switch back to the Greco Gambit since I'm going over some of these lines. One of my students played it and that inspired me to kind of look at the, some more Greco Gambit stuff. But I kind of rotate through different gambits. And again, this is a great opening for beginners to get good at realizing attacking ideas. It's always more fun to be the attacker than defender. It's easier. And that's not, a lot of people say that, and it's not actually a lie. It's really true. Again, you only make one mistake as the defender, and then many times it's checkmate. You make one mistake as the attacker, and usually the game keeps on going. You might be down a pawn or two, but usually the game keeps on going, right? You're not checkmated on the next move, at least not usually. All right, let's get into some Greco Gambit. All right, so e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, starting off on Italian. After they play bishop c5, you play c3. Small pawn move supports large pawn move. So we're aiming for getting in our sweet control of the center, our sweet center control with our pawn duo. So we're looking to get in d4 as soon as possible. The most normal reply is knight f6, making it so they can castle, but also trying to do a tempo, attacking our pawn. So here's a fork in the road, one of the first ones for white, and that is, do you want to continue spicy with the Greco attack, and possibly the Greco Gambit, where you're offering this pawn later, or do you want to go a little bit slower and protect your pawn right away, which is very playable. Most of the top players in the world actually play this line at some point, and it's very solid. Trust me, it's very solid. It's slow, but it's very solid. So that's going to be a different series at some point, and right now we're talking about the Greco Gambit, and definitely I went to go take over the center. The most normal response is, with these two attacks on the bishop and two attackers on their e-pawn, the most normal response is to trade away the heading, and this gives white for the moment that dominant center, that snowplow. This is what we're aiming for, and black's got to make a choice. Are they going to take that pawn shortly and kind of destroy our center and not let us have this pawn duo? Or are they going to let us keep it, and it's really strong for white. It's a lot of control. It's a tough decision for black in some ways. Most of the time, they'll jump to the side, bishop b4 in check, do this with tempo, makes a lot of sense. And here we come to a fork in the road again for white. There's main ways of blocking. The knight could go to d2 too, but it doesn't quite make as much sense as knight to c3. You're offering up this pawn, and bishop to d2, you're kind of not offering up this pawn. So if you're black and you're playing against this, you're always going to keep your eyes out for getting in d5. d5 usually means you're safe, you're solid, you have your piece of the sweet center, and usually it means black's equal. And being a pawn up, white's in a danger of not just black being equal, but even being a little bit better. So white has to keep eyes out on black playing d5 also. So as we're looking at this specific choice here for white, we're also thinking about if black can play d5. So we're going to go with knight c3. But what happens if you play the quieter, not quite as spicy, bishop d2? Well, this is the opportunity for black to actually get in d5. Not necessarily to win a pawn, but more importantly, yes, they'll have the pawn, but they'll be able to stabilize the center by playing d5 and take away a lot of white's attacking ideas. For example, bishop d2, capture, we tag back with the knight, and now notice our knight ends up being on, or B knight ends up being on d2, not c3. On c3, at some point it would help control d5. Here, yes, it protects our e4 pawn, but it does not help control d5. Here's the perfect moment. Boom. Black can get in d5, and this stabilizes the center. Now here, did black actually win a pawn? No. But their king is going to have time to castle. They are totally safe here, and they have their piece of the center. So this is very solid for black. But white still has a lot of opportunities to keep playing, of course. Bishop can choose d3 or b5. You can try to go forward if black doesn't take your pawn, which they should. They should take away your pawn duo as soon as possible. And black should be okay. I do get this question sometimes when I go over this with some of my students. What happens if they actually, because this bishop is pinned and the bishop on b4 is protected, what if now black tries to take that pawn and keep it? Well, this is actually not a good way for black to really proceed. Capture, capture on b4s, and both these knights are kind of overextended, and now white has a couple great options here. You can take on f7 check right away and then play b3, or you can play queen b3 right now, setting up the battery and attacking the knight. But either option, white has scored very well in tournaments with this particular position. And notice, because you're getting a pawn back and you're messing up castling, or you're putting pressure, probably going to get a pawn back and mess up castling anyway if you play queen b3 first. Notice, this is actually much better for white. You're not even really gambling, you're getting a pawn back. All right, so that's not a great way for black to proceed. So taking that e-pawn here doesn't really help. They need to make this trade and then play d5. Remember, d5 for black. So when we back up and we capture and they say checkers on b4, I like to proceed with the Greco Gambit idea of knight c3. And this is much spicier, and this really makes black have to ponder the situation, because if they don't take this pawn, they're inviting white going forward and really just dominating this game. If they take the pawn, which makes a lot of sense because they want to break up this pawn duo, they want to take something away from white. This is what white's looking for in this Greco attack, and now it becomes the gambit. Now we're in the heart of the Greco Gambit. And white is going to try to use the fact that it's going to take a lot of time before some of these pieces even participate in a game for black, especially these queenside pieces. Many games, they never participate. So white has a lot of time, but you can't just do anything. You have to still be aggressive, because one thing about time is it's an advantage, but it can go away. If these pieces for black come out and play, if they get to good positions later, then you've lost all your advantage of time. So you have to keep doing things with threats. And here, we castle, and now there's a threat of, since this knight on c3 is not pinned, of taking their knight. Okay, and this is what I played. And here's another fork in the road now, but it's for black. They have to deal with this threat. And most of the time, the idea is trade something. The threat is the knight on c3 capturing, so you remove it, or you trade away the threat. So here's a couple choices. In the first video, my student, they played knight takes c3 against him, and this is actually not as good or as safe as the bishop takes first. Bishop takes has a much better record for black and is a little bit safer. The knight capturing, if this happens, plain and simple, you're capturing back, you're doing it with tempo because you're attacking the bishop. They still don't have time to castle. They could try to get a little funky with d5, but white usually can dodge and still get very good games in that situation. Or you can actually try to capture, and white still has a lot of good play because this E line is open. If this rook jumps on here check, that's going to be very painful for black. So white still has a great position, and black doesn't really have time to castle because this bishop is attacked. Most beginners want to keep the bishop versus that knight, because the bishop, after it captures here, looks like it's controlling a lot, right? Aiming for a free rook, controlling e1 for the moment, and bishops are faster pieces, and since this position has become open, this bishop would seem like the smarter piece to keep. But the truth is, capturing with the bishop first is actually a much smarter idea. Basically because when the bishop captures, if white allows it, and obviously white shouldn't allow it, but if white allows it and they capture back with the pawn, now we come to this opportunity, yet again, we talk about it, for d5. And d5 again stabilizes the position for black. Everything's kind of locked down in the center, and black is an extra pawn. And it doesn't mean the game is over. The number one move here for white is usually queen c2, which is interesting. It puts pressure on the knight, so if they go to take the bishop, you'll take the knight. You're actually protecting your pawn here because this knight was attacking it, just in case after they castle, they could try to capture it. So that's one way to play this. You don't have to play queen c2, though. You could move your bishop first to d3, which makes a lot of sense to put pressure along this diagonal towards h7. You can play positionally, pinning this knight and probably capturing it and messing up their pawns because their extra pawn becomes half a pawn, if you will, because it's doubled, and you can, again, try to put pressure on their position. But again, this is not what white is looking for with a gambit. You don't play gambits in order to try to play positionally later. At least usually you don't. If you have to, you have to. Also, here's another interesting idea I just wanted to throw out, where you can play bishop d3 first. Right? The line, instead of taking, and then they play d5, many times you run back to d3. Well, maybe you play bishop d3 first and see what black does. And you'll get a piece back, because, you know, right now black's up a piece. So this is one way to see how black would play. And many beginners try to save their bishop. Again, they like the bishops better. Okay, they save the bishop. We capture our piece back, and now they play their d5. I think a really good position for white is you run back with your bishop, because you don't want to lose it, obviously. And now you still keep, notice the difference in this position. You keep a lot of firepower aiming at their king side for when they castle. And the fact that you can go queen c2 or queen d3 and set up this powerful battery really gives white a lot of firepower and chances in this type of position. You can still expand on the queen side, locking it down a bit. You still have very active pieces. And you really are making black work here. So even if you're going to be down a pawn and you get in d5, I would like this position versus some of the others. All right, but let's get back to this. Bishop takes on c3. So we've already seen that if we just capture back and they play d5, black should be doing very well. How does white proceed here? How do we keep it spicy? How do we keep our attacking chances going? And that is a fine question. And for many years, and then we're talking hundreds of years ago, for many years, this seemed to be the recipe to kind of defeat white's idea here. And someone was playing around with this position and said, well, if black is trying to get in d5 and that's going to help black, what if we try d5? What an interesting concept. Normally you don't think about going forward right away because you're blocking your own bishop. This bishop's aiming for the f-pawn. It's the reason why you put it there. It's a great attacking bishop. Wouldn't d5 just block it? And oh yes, black just captured a piece. White's down a piece. Well, it turns out if you look closely, and this is the move I love to keep it spicy, turns out that there's no way for black to really keep their piece, right? They're up a piece, but you're attacking the bishop on c3. You're attacking the knight on c6. There are also ideas of rook to e1 or queen to e2, or maybe both. And since their king is still in the center, pinning that knight, so knight kind of counts as one of the pieces you might get back. So there's really no way for black ultimately to keep their piece here. And because we've stopped black from getting in d5, there's still tons of good attacking chances here. And it's going to, again, take a while for black to get these queenside pieces active and part of the game. So white still has time, and we're using it here. So here, my opponent played bishop f6. This is probably the number one response. You keep the bishop, but you put it on the king side to help with defense on the king side. Notice how this bishop has traveled, right? It went, let's see, c5, then it got attacked and jumped over here for check, then it made a capture, then it could run back. I mean, this bishop's been very active. It's in a lot of moves while these queenside pieces are going, hey, dark squared bishop, why do you have all the action, all the fun? But that does kind of make sense. Being serious for a moment, this is the number one idea, maybe, for that bishop to come back to the king side, save the bishop. But there are actually a lot of moves here for black. And this will be the last part of the opening we talk about. Then I'll just run through the Blitz game because, again, Blitz games 3 minutes and 5 minutes are a lot of fun, but the end of the games can be messy, and it's not necessarily important. We're just talking about the opening here. But I can run through the moves real quick so you can kind of see what happened, of course. But bishop f6 was played, and that might be the number one move here. Some of the other moves here are knight to e5. This knight was attacked, so you get it away from being attacked, and you try to make your own threat, okay? To this, you can capture, and queen up. Is actually kind of a triple fork for the moment, and white's done very well in this position, even though black is up a piece. For the moment, white gets tremendous attacks. Many times they get a piece back, or they break up the king side on g7, and white gets tremendous attacks. So there is knight e5. The next one is, instead they move the knight to a safer spot. And one of the reasons this knight on c6 that black thinks about saving it is simply to plug up the E line. Again, this E line many times can be white's trump card here because that king is still in the center for a little bit. And when white can get major pieces on that line, many times this spells doom for black. So knight e7 makes a lot of sense. You put it to a safer spot. It's already protected by the queen, right? And the king can castle, and you're plugging up the E line. All right, so the knight going to two different spots over here makes sense. Whoops, let's get these arrows correct. But there's also yet another place, knight a5, which some people try. I don't like this as much. And yes, it does attack the bishop. And you still can play the line I showed you where you take the bishop, they take the bishop on c4, and you play queen d4. And this is a great line for white. But now there's some other options for white. This knight is kind of out of play over here. It's making a threat, but it's on the side of the board. A good move, a very good move, is actually just backing up with this bishop now and continuing the threats. You're still going to get your piece back as you're attacking two pieces. You still have the ideas of jumping on the E line, but you're now trying to strand this knight along the edge. So I don't like knight a5 as much as some of the other moves. So I would say after d5 for white, bishop f6 number one, maybe knight e7 safely is number two. And then the last move is, instead of these moves after d5, instead of this knight moving somewhere, and instead of saving this bishop, black just says, there's too many choices here. I'm just going to castle. White, take your pick. Whatever you want to take. I don't want to think about it anymore. So there is that too. I mean, obviously black wants to castle at some point. So now, one of the things about playing d5, and then we'll just run through the rest of these moves, is that black can't play d5, but black still needs to get in d6 at some point, sooner than later, just to get this bishop rolling, part of the game. There are ideas, by the way, especially if this knight gets moved or traded or something happens to it, it leaves the e4, which is for d6. There are ideas from white where you actually go forward and you sacrifice this pawn. Now, white's already down one pawn, but very active position, they have time. Why give up the second pawn? Well, if they capture, which is pretty much forced in many of these variations, and even if they don't capture, you just leave your pawn here. Once your pawn's on d6, or once their pawn's on d6, this d7 pawn's not going anywhere. And that really cements this advantage of time for a long period. Makes it much harder for this bishop to come out, actually impossible to come out this way along this diagonal, basically. They're going to have to play b6 and get their bishop out this way. Again, takes a lot of time. So that's one of the ideas here to help keep them cramped, perhaps, and keep your advantage of time. It doesn't happen every game, but it's just one of the ideas to keep here. And once you play d5 as white, it usually means your bishop needs to go someplace else. Usually d3, aiming at h7, is really good. Once in a while, when they play d6, that means sometimes going along this diagonal, right? The h4 through e8 diagonal, that'll be the choice also. You might get a check, or you might get a trade at the right time, depending on what you need. But this bishop is very flexible, especially after d5. You can always run back to this diagonal, which is very strong. All right, so those are the 5 choices here. After white wants to keep it spicy and play d5, 5 choices. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 for black. So there's 5 forks in the road here. And white played d5 to keep it spicy, keep the attacks going. All right, I'm just going to run through the rest of the moves. I'm not really going to talk about them. Let's finish this video up here, okay? So you can kind of see what happened here. They saved their bishop. I decided to get this rook active, right? Put it on the E line and pin that knight. Could have taken the knight in C6. Oh yeah, and there was one more thing I wanted to show you. So this is the last one. Now, I usually in these positions activate my rook, but looking closer, let's go to my favorite website, and I'll just get my picture out of the way here so you can see some of these moves here. And here's this position. Whoops, not the correct position. Hold on. Okay, here's the correct position, and they just saved their bishop with bishop f6. Now, I was talking about in my game I played rook e1. This is the move I played, and it's actually the #1 move in this position. But it turns out that capturing the knight on c6 has a much better result for white. Not as many games in this database. Now, every database of chess games might be different. But here, notice, we're talking 57% winning for white. Very few draws, and 36% for black. But this is a huge advantage for white. It's almost 2-1, and anytime you're 50% or more in the openings for white or for black, when you're looking up to try to win with black, but once you're 50% or more win percentage, that's a good opening, especially when it's 50-60% for white and 35-25% for black. Notice rook e1 actually overall in this database, even though it's the #1 move, favors black more. It's so spicy. So that's kind of weird, even though I've won a lot of games playing rook e1 also. But it turns out d takes c6 here has a better reputation, a better result. So I'm going to have to look into this a little bit more, and if I start playing this gambit again, I'm going to have to look into capturing on c6 instead of activating my rook. Just seems natural to activate the rook. All right, let's just run through these moves. And you can see I'm just trying to keep the pressure up on the E line and on the king side. Interesting moment. I have my gun set up. I'm really using the E line on their knight. They decide to give the bishop up instead of the knight, and once I take the bishop, they played f6. Very interesting. I have this crazy position pawn all the way in e6, but they're using it as a barrier to try to keep their king safe. It's actually not a bad idea. Now I'm just thinking of ways of trying to get to their king. And in this particular position, they should not have played d5. My threat is queen to h5. They didn't pay enough attention, and in blitz games, that happens a lot. They probably should play g6 and just make it harder for me to infiltrate and get that king. They did not, so the game ended very quickly over here. All right, hopefully this showed you one possibility for playing the Greco Gambit, the Greco attack. And let's get in one quick joke. All right, why was the baby strawberry crying? And babies do cry a lot, and once in a while they play chess, maybe they lose the game, they start to cry. You should never cry. You should just set up the pieces and start a new game. But again, why was the baby strawberry crying? Well, because his parents were in a jam. All right, guys, this is Chess Coach Aaron. Try to play some Greco attack, Greco Gambit, and practice getting better at being an attacker. Peace. Have a good weekend.